Character notes. Piper Hollies, narrator, director of calibration architecture at Cygnus Quantum Systems, methodical, patient, raised by a mechanic father whose values shaped her approach to work and conflict. Paxton Grayson, founder and CEO of Cygnus, magnetic but increasingly obsessed with valuation and exit numbers. Ren Cass-Allen, a junior engineer Piper mentored for 3 years. Desmond Vance, the operations executive Paxton installed to take credit for Piper's work. June Okafor, Paxton's assistant, warm and observant. Naomi Frost, the diligence lead sent by Northbridge to review the acquisition. Richard Chun, Cygnus's general counsel. Margaret Whitfield, the longest-serving board member. Harrison Lowe, Dr. Sarah Kermani, Alan Chu. Other board members. Evelyn's storyline does not appear here. This is a separate narrative. Sunlight through the glass wall of his office had gone flat and cold, and Paxton Grayson didn't even lift his eyes from the tablet in his hand as he dismantled 11 years of my work in a single sentence. "Your roles are cancelled, effective immediately," he said, thumbing through his investment portfolio like he was flicking away a crumb. Then, barely glancing up, "Surrender the system data. All of it." I pressed the folder against my chest and let myself smile, because I'd learned long ago that composure is the one thing a man like Paxton can never fake. "I'm afraid I cannot," I said. That got his attention. "It's not yours to own." Something flickered beneath his polished surface. Not anger yet, just the first hairline crack in a man who'd never once heard the word no from someone he'd already written off. He set the tablet down with the slow, deliberate motion of a man accustomed to silence trailing him into every room. Welcome to the reckoning that happens quietly, in offices with glass walls, when the people written off in a single sentence turn out to be the ones holding the whole structure up. If you enjoy watching quiet competence outlast loud arrogance, following along is the easiest way to catch more of these. We'll circle back to that office and the exact moment it stopped belonging to him. First, though, it helps to understand who was sitting across that desk. My name is Piper Hollies, and back then I held the title of Director of Calibration Architecture at Cygnus Quantum Systems. Sounds sleek and corporate, and by that point I suppose it was. But I didn't come from anything polished. I was raised in a small town in eastern Tennessee, the kind of place where the diner and the hardware store shared a single parking lot, and my father spent 31 years repairing other people's farm equipment inside a tin roof shop that turned into an oven every July and an icebox every January. People hear that and assume I'm about to say we were poor. We weren't, not really. We had enough. What I'm actually telling you is that I grew up watching a man kneel in the mud beside some stranger's broken tractor and treat both the machine and the person with more respect than most boardrooms ever manage. My father never once acted like unglamorous work was beneath him. He understood that the person whose livelihood rode on that engine was frightened and worn down and counting on him. He repaired the machine, but mostly he studied the man standing beside it. That's the only inheritance that ever mattered to me. The understanding that the people quietly doing the load-bearing work are usually the ones nobody thanks, and that empathy isn't softness. It's simply paying attention to who's actually carrying the weight. I carried plenty of weight at Cygnus. We built quantum processors, and the industry's dirty little secret is that hardware is easy to brag about and nearly impossible to use. A quantum processor without proper calibration is just an expensive box full of noise. Qubits drift. They lose coherence in fractions of a second. They lie to you constantly. What turns that chaos into something a customer can actually run workloads on is the calibration architecture, the layered system of error correction models, drift compensation, and provenance logging that I'd spent nearly a decade building from nothing. When I joined, Cygnus was 9 people crammed into a leased lab outside Austin, running on Paxton's pitch deck and a single prototype that functioned maybe one morning out of 3. I was employee number 6. I built the first calibration pipeline alone on a borrowed workstation, through a winter where I slept more nights on the lab couch than in my own bed. By the time the office had glass walls, that pipeline was the reason customers kept paying us. National labs ran on it. A pharmaceutical consortium ran their molecular simulations through it. A defense research group used it under a contract so carefully worded our lawyers needed 4 months just to sign off. The hardware landed the magazine covers. My architecture landed the renewals. Paxton knew it. He simply never said so out loud, because admitting it would have meant conceding that the most valuable thing his company owned had been built by someone who still drove an 8-year-old sedan and ate lunch beside the junior engineers. I should be fair to Paxton, because the truth serves this story better than the grudge does. He wasn't stupid. He had the kind of magnetism founders sometimes carry. He could walk into a room of skeptical investors and walk out with both their money and their gratitude. He'd built something genuine, and for years I respected the hunger driving him, even when I didn't much like the man himself. The trouble was that somewhere along the way, the company stopped being the thing he wanted and turned into the thing he wanted to sell. He began discussing valuation the way other people discuss the weather, endlessly and without any warmth. Every decision got measured against one question. Does this make the exit bigger? People became headcount. Customers became logos on a slide. And the calibration architecture, my 11 years, was to him simply an asset on a balance sheet, a line item he could package and trade away. I might never have collided with him over any of it if not for the deal. That spring, Northbridge came calling. Northbridge is one of those sprawling tech conglomerates that buys promising companies the way some people buy lottery tickets, in fistfuls hoping one pays off. They wanted Cygnus, or more precisely, they wanted what Cygnus could do, and Paxton had been chasing exactly this outcome for years. The number on the table was the kind that ends arguments. On paper, it would have made him one of the wealthiest men in the state. There was only one problem, and it was a problem I'd planted years earlier quietly when nobody was paying attention. The deepest layers of the calibration architecture hadn't been built in isolation. The most valuable error correction models, the ones that made our processors usable for the hardest real-world workloads, had been developed jointly through a formal research collaboration with the Hartwell National Laboratory. That partnership was something I'd pushed for back when Paxton still considered academic collaborations a waste of engineering time. He'd signed the agreement because the lab brought funding and talent, and he'd signed it without reading past the first page. I read every page. More than that, I wrote half of them, sitting across a table from the lab's counsel for 4 straight months, insisting on language most founders would have called paranoid. The joint IP provisions, the data provenance requirements, a clause stating that any transfer, license, or sale of the jointly developed models required the lab's written consent and full disclosure of the encumbrance to any acquiring party. I didn't write those clauses to protect myself. I wrote them because I'd watched, at a previous company, a brilliant team's work get quietly sold out from under them, stripped of attribution, buried inside a product that erased every fingerprint of who'd built it. I promised myself I'd never let people doing that kind of load-bearing work vanish like that again, so I built the protection straight into the foundation, where it couldn't be casually undone, and then I documented it so thoroughly that the documentation became its own kind of bedrock. Every model trained jointly with Hartwell carried its provenance tag. Every data lineage was logged, the access protocols, the consent requirements, the disclosure obligations, all of it living inside a system of records I maintained with the same patience my father brought to a stripped bolt quietly and consistently year after year. Paxton had no idea any of it existed. To him, the calibration architecture was simply his, an undifferentiated asset, owned outright, free and clear, ready to hand over to Northbridge in a clean transfer that would justify that argument-ending number. He was about to discover the difference between owning a thing and merely being entitled to it. I first heard trouble was brewing from Ren. Ren Casallen was a junior engineer I'd mentored for 3 years, sharp, earnest, and still young enough to believe good work spoke entirely for itself. She found me in the lab on a Tuesday, her expression carrying the particular tightness of someone who'd overheard something she wasn't meant to. "They're restructuring your team," she said quietly. "I saw the org chart in the shared drive before someone locked it. Your name isn't on it anymore." I kept my hand steady on the keyboard. "Whose name is at the top?" "Desmond Vance." She said it almost like an apology. Vance was the operations executive Paxton had brought in 6 months earlier. A man whose entire skill set consisted of making other people's work look like his own. "Piper, they took you off the architecture. They gave it to Vance." I thanked her and told her to return to her bench and let none of it touch her, because she had a career ahead of her and I wouldn't let it become collateral damage. Then I sat for a long moment in the hum of the cooling systems, understanding exactly what was unfolding. They meant to remove me, claim the architecture as clean company property, and hand it to Northbridge without ever mentioning Hartwell to anyone. I want to be honest about that moment because the temptation in a story like this is to claim serenity, and I wasn't serene. Heat rushed up the back of my neck. The particular humiliation of learning about your own erasure from a kid who'd stumbled onto it on a shared drive before anyone bothered telling you directly. But underneath that heat sat something steadier, carrying my father's voice. He used to say that when a job goes wrong, the worst thing you can do is start swinging. You stop. You study the whole machine. You find the one part that's actually broken, fix that, and don't waste a single motion on anything else. So I didn't storm into Paxton's office. I didn't fire off a furious email. I didn't call a lawyer in a panic. Instead, I went home, brewed a pot of coffee, and spent the night doing the most tedious, most devastating thing a person in my position could do. I organized my records. 11 years of provenance logs. The full text of the Hartwell collaboration agreement, its consent and disclosure clauses highlighted and cross-referenced. The data lineage for every jointly developed model, laying out in plain, timestamp detail exactly which parts of the architecture could not legally transfer without the lab's written approval and full disclosure to Northbridge. Every internal message where Paxton or Vance had referred to the architecture as wholly owned. The signed agreement, bearing Paxton's own signature beneath language he'd never actually read. I altered nothing. I didn't need to. Properly documented truth is a far more patient weapon than any lie. I simply assembled it into a single, clean, undeniable package, the kind of record that doesn't need to argue because it doesn't have to. Then I waited because timing is its own form of mercy. There's a version of this story where I detonate everything immediately, and in that version plenty of innocent people lose their jobs when the company implodes, ran the lab technicians, the whole team that had nothing to do with Paxton's greed. I didn't want that. My father never destroyed a tractor to prove its owner had mistreated it. He fixed what was broken and let the repair speak for itself. So I let Paxton come to me. It took 9 days of being quietly excluded from meetings I'd run for years, of watching Vance present my architecture to leadership in a tone that made it sound like he dreamed it up himself, of pretending not to notice conversations dying the moment I walked into the break room. I endured it the way you endure a long, slow descent, patiently, both hands steady on the wheel. On the 9th day, the summons arrived. Paxton's assistant, a kind woman named June Okafor who treated everyone with the same warmth regardless of title, sent me a calendar invite with no subject line. June caught my eye as I passed her desk on my way in, and something in her expression, a flicker of warning maybe or apology, told me she already knew. People in her position always know first. Which brings us back to where this began, the glass walls, the cold afternoon light, Paxton not lifting his eyes. Your roles are cancelled, effective immediately. Surrender the system data, all of it. I'm afraid I cannot. It's not yours to own. He set the tablet down. For the first time in years, I had his complete attention. Excuse me. He laughed, the short, disbelieving laugh of a man genuinely struggling to process what he'd just heard. Piper, I'm going to say this slowly, because I think you're confused about the situation. You work for me. The architecture is company property. You will transfer every model, every data set, every line of it to Desmond by end of day, or this stops being a polite conversation. I didn't raise my voice. My father never did either. The core error correction models were developed jointly with Hartwell National Laboratory, I said. Under an agreement you signed. That agreement requires the lab's written consent for any transfer or sale, and it requires full disclosure of that encumbrance to any acquiring party. Which means the architecture can't be handed to Desmond, and it certainly can't be handed to Northbridge as clean, unencumbered IP. Because it isn't. And I'd imagine Northbridge's diligence team would find that distinction very interesting. The room went very quiet. I watched the words land, watched him scroll backward through years of half-remembered signatures, watched the exact moment he realized he didn't actually know what he'd signed. That's the trouble with men who never read past the first page. They spend their whole lives certain they own things they've only ever borrowed. Paxton recovered fast, I'll give him that. The smoothness slid back over his face like water closing over a dropped stone. You're bluffing, he said. And even if there's some clause in there, clauses get renegotiated. The lab will sign whatever we put in front of them. That's not your concern anymore. You're done here. He stood, shoving his chair back hard enough that it rolled and struck the credenza behind him with a dull thunk. The motion was meant to intimidate, to use his height and the expanse of his office to remind me how small my position had become. He walked to the window, hands in his pockets, shoulders tight beneath his tailored jacket. Maybe they will sign, I agreed, staying seated, keeping my tone level. But they'll only sign if they're asked openly, with the encumbrance disclosed. And the moment it's disclosed, Northbridge knows the architecture isn't clean. They know a third party holds rights over the most valuable models in the deal. That changes the number, Paxton. Changes it a great deal. Deals like this are priced on certainty. You're about to introduce a very large uncertainty. He spun back toward me, and I saw his hand emerge from his pocket, index finger extended like he was about to make a point to the board. The gesture died halfway. He caught himself, let his hand drop, recalculated. Then I'll restructure the transfer so the lab's models are carved out. I opened the folder in my lap, pulled out a single page, the system architecture diagram, the one showing every dependency, every integration point, and set it on the edge of his desk. I didn't slide it toward him. I didn't need to perform. I simply left it where he could see it if he chose to look. You can't carve them out, I said gently, almost kindly, because there was no joy in watching a man discover the floor beneath him had never actually been his. The Hartwell models aren't a separate module you can lift out. They're woven through the entire correction stack. The drift compensation depends on them. The provenance layer depends on them. I built it that way. He moved back to the desk, grabbed the diagram, held it up as though searching for a lie hidden in the lines and boxes. His eyes tracked across it, left to right, top to bottom, but I already knew what he was seeing: nothing. A map to a country he'd never visited, written in a language he'd never bothered learning. He dropped it back onto the desk, pressed both palms flat against the glass surface, leaned forward. Remove them and the architecture doesn't degrade, I continued. It stops working. You'd be selling Northbridge a very expensive box of noise. For a long moment he just stared at the diagram, then at me, then out the window, as though the answer might be hovering somewhere over the downtown skyline. His jaw worked silently. He picked up his tablet, set it back down, adjusted his collar though it needed no adjusting. These were the movements of a man whose entire plan had just revealed itself as sand, discovering it alone, in front of the one person he'd most wanted erased. I hadn't built the architecture that way to trap him. I'd built it that way because it was simply good engineering, deeply integrated, mutually reinforcing, robust. But good engineering and good protection often turn out to be the same thing. And the foundation I'd poured 11 years earlier to make the system function was the very foundation that now made it impossible to steal. Paxton stared at me, and I think it was the first time he'd truly seen me. Not the line item, not the head count, but the person who'd been holding up his building the entire time he watched the valuation climb. "What do you want?" he said finally. It wasn't really a question. It was a man reaching for his one remaining instinct, finding the price. And this is the part I'm proudest of, because there was a younger, angrier version of me who would have named a number, a title, a pound of flesh. My father's voice came back to me again. You don't fix a machine to make its owner grovel. You fix it because the work deserves to be done right. I don't want anything from you, I said. I want what I've always wanted, for the work to be honest. The lab needs to be told the truth and asked properly. Northbridge needs to know what they're actually buying. The people on my team who built this with me need their names on it. Do that and you'll have a real deal, smaller, honest. Or don't, and let it collapse under its own dishonesty during diligence. That part's up to you. But I won't be the one who hands them a lie. I set the folder I'd been holding on his desk. This is everything, I said. I'm not threatening you with it. I'm giving it to you so that whatever you decide with your eyes open this time. I read past the first page. I always do. I stood, smoothed my jacket, and turned toward the door. Behind me I heard him lift the folder, heard the papers rustle as he opened it. I didn't look back. My hand was on the handle when his voice came again, smaller this time, the edge gone out of it. Piper. I stopped, didn't turn, just waited. You're making a mistake, he said, though there was no conviction left in it. Just a man saying words because they were all he had left. No, I said quietly, still facing the door. I'm correcting one. Then I walked out, past June, who offered the smallest nod, and back to the lab, where I sat down at my bench and finished documenting a calibration run as though it were any other Tuesday, because the work was still the work, and it still deserved to be done properly. I didn't need to wonder what would happen next, because I'd already done the only thing within my control. I'd told the truth and built it on a foundation strong enough to hold. The collapse when it came didn't come from me. It came from Northbridge. Diligence teams are paid to be paranoid. And the good ones are very good indeed. Northbridge sent a woman named Naomi Frost to lead the technical and legal review. And Naomi handled a data room the way a surgeon handles an open chest. Slowly, thoroughly, missing nothing. I never spoke to her directly. I didn't need to. Because when her team started pulling at the architecture's threads, they found exactly what I'd spent 11 years ensuring any competent reviewer would find. Every model carried its provenance tag. Every jointly developed component pointed in clean, time-stamped lineage straight back to the Hartwell collaboration. The agreement sat right there in the company's own records, signed, its consent and disclosure clauses fully intact. What I did witness was the day they found it. I was in the lab running a stability test with Ren when Vance came through the door moving faster than I'd ever seen him move. His face had gone pale beneath his golf course tan. He made straight for the server room, yanked the door open, and stood there staring at the racks as though they might rearrange themselves into a more convenient truth. Phone pressed to his ear, he said. No, I'm looking at it now. I don't, it's tagged. Every single module has. He turned, saw me watching through the glass, and our eyes met. He knew that I knew. The call ended abruptly. He walked out of the server room, past the lab, and disappeared down the hallway without a word. Ren raised her eyebrows at me. Diligence just got interesting, I said, and went back to the calibration data. 2 hours later, on my way to get coffee, I passed conference room C and saw them through the window. Naomi Frost sat at the head of the table, a slim woman in a charcoal suit, silver hair pulled back tight. Printed documents lay in front of her. I recognized the Hartwell agreements formatting from 20 feet away. Vance sat across from her, Paxton beside him, and next to Paxton sat Richard Chan, the company's general counsel, wearing the expression of a man who'd just been asked to explain why he hadn't flagged a bomb sitting in the basement. Naomi held a pen but wasn't writing, just tapping it slowly against one particular paragraph. Tulp, tulp, tulp. Then she looked up, said something I couldn't hear, and I watched Vance attempt an answer. His mouth moved. His hands lifted in a gesture that might have been explanation or surrender. Naomi's expression didn't shift. She simply waited, pen still tapping, until he ran out of words. Then she turned to Paxton, asked him something, he started to answer, stopped, looked to Richard, who pulled out his own phone and began scrolling like a man hunting for a life raft in open water. I kept walking, got my coffee, and passed the same window 10 minutes later. They were still in there, but now Naomi had a laptop open, turning it toward Vance, showing him something on the screen. I knew exactly what it was, the provenance logs, the data lineage, the timestamps showing precisely when each jointly developed model had been integrated, by whom, and under what agreement. Vance stared at the screen and said nothing. There was nothing to say. A man who steals credit can only hold on to it as long as no one asks him to explain the work. Naomi had just asked him to explain 11 years of architecture he couldn't even diagram. I returned to the lab and sat down. Ren slid a fresh printout of results across the bench toward me. That looked intense, she said carefully. Due diligence usually is, I said, and initialed the printout. There was nothing to uncover, because nothing had been hidden. That had always been the point. I hadn't buried a weapon. I'd built a system honest enough that dishonesty couldn't survive contact with it. What happened to Paxton after that, I pieced together gradually. Once Naomi's team flagged the encumbrance, Vance, who'd been presenting the architecture as his own clean work, couldn't answer a single question about it. He didn't know what Hartwell was. He didn't know the clauses existed. He'd taken credit for a machine he couldn't even describe. Under the calm, relentless questioning of a diligence lead, that emptiness became visible to everyone in the room. A man who steals credit can hold it only as long as nobody asks him a hard question, and Naomi asked many. Paxton tried to manage the fallout, told Northbridge it was a minor administrative matter, that the lab would consent, that everything would be cleaned up before close. But Naomi had already seen the internal messages describing the architecture as wholly owned, and she'd seen the dates, understanding exactly how close Cygnus had come to transferring encumbered IP to her employer as clean property, without disclosure. To a firm like Northbridge, that isn't an administrative matter. That's the line between a partner and a liability. The board meeting where everything fell apart happened on a Thursday afternoon. I wasn't in the room, but June was stationed just outside, managing the coffee service and the closed-door calendar, and she told me later what she'd seen. Margaret Whitfield arrived first, 15 minutes early, carrying a leather portfolio she set on the table with the decisive thud of someone who'd made up her mind before walking in. The other board members filed in one by one: Harrison Lowe, the venture partner who'd led the Series B; Dr. Sarah Kermani, the technical advisor; Alan Chu, the CFO who reported to the board. Paxton came last, walking in like he still owned the room. But June said his tie hung loose and sweat beaded at his hairline despite the aggressive air conditioning. The door closed. 15 minutes later, voices began rising. Not shouting, board members rarely shout, but the sharp, clipped tones that cut straight through solid oak. June heard Margaret's voice, cold and clear. "You told us it was unencumbered. You told us for 6 months. Then Harrison's angrier. "Do you have any idea what this makes us look like?" An hour in, Richard Chun stepped out, walked past June without meeting her eyes, and returned 5 minutes later with a printed copy of the Hartwell Agreement pulled from the legal files. She watched him show it to the board, watched him point to Paxton's signature at the bottom of page 12. 2 hours in, Paxton came out alone, jacket off, tie gone entirely. He went to the men's room, stayed 10 minutes, came back, went back in. June said he looked like a man who just watched his own empire collapse in real time, and was trying to figure out which piece of rubble to stand on. When the meeting finally ended, Margaret came out first and asked June to schedule a follow-up with outside counsel for the next morning. The others filed out in silence. Paxton was last, standing in the doorway a moment, looking back into the empty conference room, then walking down the hall toward his office with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders curved forward. June said it was the walk of a man who already knew he was gone. The deal never closed at that argument-ending number. It didn't close at all, not in the form Paxton wanted. Northbridge withdrew its original offer, and the board, which had been told for months the exit was certain, finally started asking its own hard questions about why their most valuable asset had a third party's name woven through it that none of them had been briefed on, and about why the founder had tried to remove the one person who understood all of it right before the sale. A board can forgive a founder almost anything except making them look like fools in front of the firm about to make them rich. Margaret Whitfield, the board's longest-serving member and the only one who'd ever bothered to learn my name, made the call, I heard later. She brought in outside counsel, and counsel found exactly what I'd documented, because I documented it for precisely this reason. The board concluded, in the careful language such bodies favor, that Paxton Grayson's judgment was no longer aligned with the company's interests. He wasn't marched out. Men at his level rarely are. He was eased toward the door over a few quiet weeks, his title softened into something advisory and meaningless, his authority drained one signature at a time until nothing remained to sign. The man who'd measured everything by the size of the exit was removed precisely because he'd nearly destroyed it. Desmond Vance was gone within the month. You can't build a career standing in someone else's light, once that light gets turned directly on you. And the architecture, my 11 years, the load-bearing thing, stayed exactly where it belonged. Whole. Honest. Properly attributed. The Hartwell collaboration was disclosed, the lab was asked properly and consented gladly, and a smaller, cleaner version of the Northbridge partnership eventually went through. The honest one I told Paxton was still possible. Worth less on paper. Worth infinitely more in every way that lasts. Margaret Whitfield asked to meet with me about a week after Paxton's authority had quietly evaporated. We sat in that same glass office, though it no longer felt cold, just bright. "The board would like you to take over the architecture officially," she said. "Title, compensation, a seat in the rooms where decisions get made. You've effectively been running it for 11 years. We'd like to stop pretending otherwise." I considered it longer than she expected. There was a time the offer would have felt like vindication, and there's nothing wrong with vindication. But I'd learned something during those 9 days of being walked out of my own meetings, and it was this: I'd never needed the title to do the work, and I didn't want to do the work for the title now. "I'll take it," I told her, "on one condition. Ren Cass-Allen gets her name on the architecture. So does every engineer who built it with me. The provenance system tracks people, not just data. I want the record to show who actually carried this, all of them, and I want that permanent the way the rest of the foundation is permanent." Margaret smiled, the smile of someone who'd spent a long career watching credit flow upward, and was quietly delighted to see it flow back down for once. Done, she said. I kept the job 2 more years, and they were good years, the kind where the work and the recognition finally pointed in the same direction. Ren made senior engineer on her own merits and began mentoring juniors of her own, and I watched her treat the newest, most junior person on the team with the same dignity my father once brought to a stranger's broken tractor, understanding that the only inheritance worth anything had been passed along again. I still carry my father's voice in my head. Stop. Study the whole machine. Find the one part that's actually broken, fix that, and don't waste a single motion on the rest. I've come to believe that isn't just advice for engines. It's the entire quiet philosophy behind how the overlooked outlast the arrogant, not by swinging, not by burning the building down, but by understanding the machine more deeply than the people who think they own it, and by writing down the truth so plainly, so patiently, that when the moment finally arrives, you never have to raise your voice at all. The documentation does the speaking. Paxton Grayson believed he owned the most valuable thing in his company. What he never understood was that you can't own the thing you never bothered to understand. He saw the architecture as a line on a balance sheet. It was actually a foundation. And foundations belong to whoever poured them, not on paper, but in the only ledger that finally matters, the one recording who showed up winter after winter, and did the load-bearing work no one else wanted to see. Not long afterward, I updated my own resume the way you do when a chapter closes well instead of badly, and under my years at Cygnus I wrote a single line, built the thing that held. It was enough. It was true. And truth, properly documented, turned out to be the only weapon I ever needed. If this story stuck with you, if you find yourself rooting for the quiet ones holding the building up, following along is the simplest way to catch more of these. We're working our way towards 7,000 here, one honest story at a time, and getting there together would mean a great deal. Hit follow and let's reach it together.